Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Vorhies, your host. I'm the Editorial Director with Data Science Central and also Chief Data Scientist for Data Magnum. I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including Pivotal, Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, and Teradata, to name just a few. You know, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you haven't had an opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Today's webinar is entitled 100 Years of Data Visualization. It's time to stop making the same mistakes. So before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's webinar will be an hour long. We'll have one panelist who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be a 10 to 15 minute QA following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation. We'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the QA portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Andy Cotgreave of Tableau. Andy is a senior consultant at Tableau. And prior to that, he was senior data analyst at the University of Oxford. In this current role, he helps new customers solve problems and develops and teaches training courses that focus on data visualization best practices. And as someone who simply loves numbers, you can find him at data-related conferences, popping up as the author of free public data visualizations, or anywhere else there's data and questions to be answered. Thanks for being with us today, Andy. We're looking forward to your presentation. In 1914, New Yorker Willard Brinton wrote Graphic Methods for Presenting Facts, the first book on telling stories through data and communicating information visually. Today, the volume of data in the world is exponentially increasing, and the tools to transform analysis into storytelling are evolving. And 100 years later, Brinton's lessons still hold true. So in today's live DSC webinar, we'll explore visualization basics that withstand the test of time, the right charts for telling the right stories, and Brinton's checklist for commuting data. Andy, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, everybody, for attending today. Great to be part of the Data Science Central webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about things from 100 years ago. I'm going to start off with a quote. Millions of dollars yearly are spent in the collection of data with the fond expectation that the data will automatically cause the correction of the conditions studied. Millions of dollars of data being spent yearly. That is something that could have been written in 2015, but no, it was written by Willard Brinton 101 years ago. Now, isn't it strange that a sentence written on page 1 of an incredible book that's 100 years old could have been transported to 2015? Why has nothing changed? Is it the fault of customers and companies and organizations? Is it the fault of the vendors like Tableau for not getting this right? Well, that's a really interesting question, which we're going to try and explore throughout the next 45 minutes. I have two objectives for the next 45 minutes. Three, actually. The first one is, as we said, to give you a couple of ideas of some of the data visualization guidelines that have stood the test of time. Through that objective, I want you all to leave here with an understanding of who Brinton was. Because this book that he wrote 101 years ago could sit on your desk now and still be as valid a guide to data visualization as any of the books that have been published in the last 20 years. The second objective is to give you a sense of, a sense of calm and a sense of zen, in that while what Brinson was trying to solve, the problems we're trying to solve today, that there are things we can solve and we can change our practices and improve the way we do things. But there are other things that, it's always going to be a problem. 100 years ago, there was too much data and not enough technology to solve the problems. 100 years later, today, there's still too much technology and too much data to kind of get through all the data-related challenges we need to today. So I want you to take away some data visualization lessons, really get an appreciation of this unknown guy, Brinton, and then realize that even if everything was perfect 100 years later today, we've still got hurdles that we're always going to overcome. So let me take you back to 1914, a time when people were busy commuting to work, busy working hard, kind of just like today. This is a picture of Liverpool Street in London, which is, you can probably tell I'm based in the UK. Busy, grimy, kind of hassle in the commutes, kind of like my daily commute to London. 100 years ago, the working environment was also going through big transitions. This is a photograph from the National Bank of Scotland, its offices in London. You can see standing desks were all the rage, an echo or a cycle that's come around again, as we now seem to be using standing desks an awful lot. But life 100 years ago in these offices was pretty hard, pretty busy, and pretty data-driven. In the late 19th century, companies had started using tables to communicate data. This is a table of data from the railroads. They were the pioneers of tabulated data. It seemed like a revolution at the time. And typewriter companies had the revolution of saying, let's put a tab key onto a typewriter. Some of you will have used the tab key to physically move carriages along on a piece of paper. Others of you in the audience probably think a tab key is just what you use to move your cursor from one text box to another in a web form. That's often the way I determine the age of my audience, depending on which way you know your tab keys. But let it be known that 1914 was an age of an explosion of big data. From handwritten daily reports that were getting collated to punch cards, an absolute revolution in data collection and analysis. And if you had the Hollerith tabulating machine for totaling the data contained on punch cards, then you too could process 3,000 records per hour. How amazing would that have been? Now, I'm sure my smartphone has processed more than 3,000 records since I probably started this talk. But it was an age of big data. We've always been in this things like 3,000 records. That's amazing. What can I do with 3,000 records of data? Now it's 3 million records or 3 billion records of data. What can I do with those? We're still in a period of having more data than we know what to do with. And if you were the chap on the right processing this machine, then that was really amazing. And in fact, this guy is Hollerith himself, who went on to create the founding company that became IBM. So Hollerith himself led to the organizations and the industry that became where we are today in 2015. 1914 is also an amazing period, and the book, Brinson's book, which I'll talk specifically about the book, but one thing about Brinson's book is about the revelations about society that Brinson talks about. And this is a sentence from the book. The punching is usually done by girls. What on earth was he talking about? Well, he wasn't talking about boxing. I use this sentence to show a reflection of what society was like in 1914. In the book itself, Brinson mentions men or man about 200-300 times. He uses the word woman not a single time, and he uses the word girl 7 or 8 times. Brinson's world was very much a man's world where men run businesses and men do the work, and in Brinson's example, girls do the card punching. So even though Brinson was ahead of his time in the book we're about to examine, he was also possibly, well, he was a reflector of society at the time, kind of misogynistic. Unfortunately, we're on our way to equality. What I love about Brinson is that he also didn't hold his punches back. And so I'm going to show you a quote, my favorite quote from the book, and maybe some people in the audience can relate to the challenges you all face as analysts. Brinson said, "There is danger in giving too much information to executives of small brain capacity." Possibly some of you relate to those issues. If you are an executive listening to this webinar, I'm sure you've got a huge brain capacity. But within that sentence, Brinton actually was making a really good point. Our job as analysts, our job as people trying to communicate data to other people, is about giving people who have, let's say they have too little time, trying to give them information which is concise and well communicated so that those people can consume the data very, very quickly. Now, let's have a quick look at who Brinton was. Why was he motivated to write this book? You know what I've just realized? The book, I haven't told you what the book is called. The book is called Graphic Methods for Presenting Facts. And it was printed in 1914. And it was the first book about data visualization, about effective data visualization. And it was written by Brinson. He was an inventor living in New York and working at this building on 11th Avenue, which is still there today. And as well as getting loads of patents and being a really, really clever engineer, he wrote this book. And he was motivated to solve the problems of the day because just like in 2015, he was seeing people making all sorts of charting errors. Even within the fact that, even though what we do today and what we did then was share a motivation to share data and to be expressive and to get the data right. If I talk first about sharing the data, what do we do now? Well, now we just publish something to the internet or publish something on our corporate server, and anybody with a logon can see, or access to the internet can see the data. People wanted to share in 1914 too, but they had to do it in different ways. This is a photograph from the book of a municipal parade in New York. It looks like it's pouring down with rain, and yet people are still out there. And what's on the back of that horse and cart is a chart about the municipal spending of data on health and welfare and education and things like that. People wanted to share data. Could you imagine printing your chart on a massive chart, putting it on a cart and getting a man with a horse to drive that thing? Well, if you are motivated to share your data, you will come up with those innovations. Brinson also recognized and wanted to encourage expressiveness. Here are two examples, both of which we'll look at in a little while. One, a map showing transit volumes in Frankfurt, another showing the explosion of people on the railroad. Another contemporary issue, particularly if you live in the southeast of the UK. But we'll look at both of those later. But his prime motivation was, yes, you want to share, yes, you want to be expressive, but just like today, you want to be effective. And I show you these two charts because already Brinton was full of examples of ways not to visualize data. You can see that the one on the left is figure 3. This was on the second page of the book. And he was like, we have to stop people doing terrible circular charts. They hadn't called them pie charts back then. Because he knew pie charts and radar charts were not effective ways of showing data. As we'll see, Brinton was very much binary. It's like rules, whereas today I'd be like, yeah, guidelines. There are times when a pie chart works. This pie chart's pretty cool. It shows family income and how much people spent on food. Apparently you spent $400 a year on food and a whopping $171.61 a year on rent. So some things certainly have changed between now and 1914. Prices have, if not the preponderance of pie charts. I'm not going to do the pop quiz. Right, so Brinson had written this book, and he was motivated to stop people making bad charts. And what I want to do now for the rest of really for the focus of the rest of the session is focus on the book itself and what we can take from the book today. And I'm going to do that into two sections. The first section, I'm just going to show some innovations that Brinson came up with to really drive home the fact that this guy, 100 years ago, was coming up with amazing ideas, just like people in the field are today. And so I want to show two examples of innovation and then do three concrete examples of best practice that you can put into the charts you maybe are making straight after this webinar. The book's about 350 pages long, and believe me, it's a really amazing read. It's an amazing read just from a historical point of view, but it's also an amazing read from a data viz practitioner's point of view. And you will learn about data visualization by reading this book. I have only got time to show you two examples of innovation and four things about best practice from the book. You'll notice that at the bottom of every slide there is a URL. And if you go to that URL, it's case sensitive, then you can find, I've taken loads of excerpts from the book to give many more examples than I can fit into this webinar. There's also a link there to go and read the actual book online. My first example of innovation is around interactivity. In 2015, interactivity with visualization tools is as easy as dragging and dropping things around in a canvas. What I'm showing here is just screenshots of Tableau. If people aren't familiar with Tableau, this is what Tableau desktop looks like. And you can change these charts literally just by dragging and dropping dimensions and measures around. You're interacting with the data and you're seeing changes as quick as you can think of questions to ask and as quick as you can move your mouse. It's an absolute revelation, and now we have this ability to change charts instantly. It seems, well, that's amazing, and what a great innovation. Thank God we're there in 2015. Well, Brinson recognized 100 years ago that actually interactivity is really, really amazing. He didn't have the benefit of technology, screens and mouses and amazing programmers and very intelligent people who could program their computers, but he did have index cards. And he suggested that instead of just doing big charts on big posters, what you should do is do one period of each measure. Break up your big line charts into smaller periods. So on an index card, as you're seeing here, he's showing just sales, so just a single measure for a single year for a single product. And what this means is once you've got these index cards filed, you could take three of them out and say, well, give me sales of 19, 10, 11, and 12. We can put these index cards on the table on top of each other like this to show a kind of seasonality view. Or you can put them side by side. And when you put them side by side, you actually see a view of the time over, the entire time series, and you can see when the highest and lowest parts of the period were. And you could take sales measures, you could take a bit of profit measures, and really start mixing and matching these index cards to come up with interactivity. Brinson had realized that interactivity was the key, and he came up with this incredible filing system methodology that enabled businesses to do that. He was trying to solve the problems we are able to solve with that today. The good news is that even a man of ordinary mental caliber can do it. So there's hope for us all. And he had a whole chapter devoted to that filing system. I have not been able to find out how many businesses successfully adopted it, but it's an amazing idea. A second example of innovation, something that we can actually apply to charts we design today, is around isotype. So here's a chart that Brinson redrew. This was a redrawing of an existing chart. It shows that the number of passengers between 1899 and 1911 was exploding. It more than doubled. And Brinson recognized the inherent tension in all data visualization. On the one hand, the charts we make need to be functional. You need to actually be able to look at the marks that represent the data and interpret what it's saying accurately. But at the same time, your charts need to be engaging. Because if all you do is just bar charts, then sometimes that's just a bit boring in business. And the tension in data visualization is always balancing functionality with with beauty to create engagement. And Brinson said, well, instead of just drawing an icon and making it bigger or smaller, and that's really bad, as we'll see in a minute, why not repeat the icons? And that was his chart, 1914. It seemed like a good idea. I choose this as an example of innovation because here is a chart from 1930. It looks very similar. It's all about home and factory weaving in England in the 19th century. This was created by Otto Neurath and his friends in Germany in the 1930s. Otto Neurath was a leading graphic designer who came up with this idea of graphic design and using little icons to represent data. Fast forward, and in design circles, Otto Neurath is the man credited with creating this system, and he called it isotype, and it's used in design extensively today. Well, that was 1930, but this chart was in 1914. What happened there? How come Brinson isn't the father of isotype? And in fact, when they went and looked at Otto Neurath's library, he had a copy of Brinson's book in his library. So it seems to me fair to say that Brinson's idea about making engaging charts using icons led to Otto Neurath's creation of the isotype. So I'm trying to put Brinson on a pedestal because he was motivated, just like we all are today, to make effective use of data. And he was also a really intelligent guy who came up with loads of great ideas. What are those ideas? Well, I'm going to show four specific ideas of how to make charts effective. Again, and these are really the lessons you could take away today to improve your charts or maybe make sensible chart choices. The first of which is don't size by area. This is the annual commerce of the world, drawn in circles that get bigger over time. So we've got data from 1850 to 1910. And Brinton was like, this is a disaster. I can't actually compare values. And he was making the point, often made in textbooks today, is that area is a really bad way of visualizing data. Not that it's bad per se, it's just that we actually aren't very good at perceiving the relative changes between areas. He used optical illusions to illustrate it, and I'm going to illustrate that example with a modern version. This chart is from The Economist from August last year, and it shows deaths per day of in Ebola-affected countries. And the point of the article that went with this was that, well, Ebola is really bad, but there are still really big diseases killing more people. So I've taken the numbers out for now, except the one in the circle at the top. Ebola, that circle at the top, the number 4, shows that 4 deaths per day in the countries. And that circle represents 4. So what is the number that is behind the question mark for diarrhea? How many deaths per day were there for diarrhea? I'm sure you're all shouting your answer at the screen. Well, the answer is 404. What most people answer, when I ask this question, most people answer, about 100, maybe 150. No, that diarrhea circle is actually 400 times bigger than the Ebola circle. And so when we look at all the values, we see that HIV and AIDS are 685 deaths per day. So the problem here is, when you size by area, it's quite easy for us to see the differences between area in big circles and small circles, but we're very, very poor at working out the precise differences. And if the two circles are similar sizes, it's actually quite hard to see the exact difference. Sometimes it's hard to see which is bigger and which is smaller. And so Brinson made this example many times in the book. This World Trade one was one example, and he redrew this chart as a line chart. You can see in the line chart that actually it's a lot easier to see the rate of growth when growth got bigger, when growth was faster and slower, and it's a lot easier to compare very accurately the differences between different periods. Don't size by area, said Brinton. I did the same. I redrew the Ebola chart using a bar chart, and here's the thing. You know, my bar chart shows the differences in the numbers very, very easily, or much more effectively than the circles. Is it a better chart? Brinson would definitely say so. But yeah, the Economist has different editorial reasons and different motivations for doing its charts, and you know, I personally would never say never about making any kind of chart. There are always reasons to use different kinds of charts and breaks and rules, but generally, I agree with Brinton. Do not size by area. Best practice number 2 is to start your axes at 0. This is a chart showing egg prices in the US from 1909 to 1912. You may think egg prices are not a big issue, but as I was preparing this talk a couple of months ago for the first time, I found this headline on the Guardian news site. Netherlands to save US after bird flu outbreak by sending egg products. Yes, egg prices are an issue even 100 years later. And I love this headline because apparently without the egg products, I don't know what would have happened to the US. If the Netherlands hadn't saved you, what would have happened if you didn't have those egg products? I don't know. But just like today, 100 years ago, the egg prices were an issue. And Brinson's issue here was, you know what? This chart makes it look like the prices went to near 0. And of course, they didn't. It's the fact that it's the y-axis that starts at 60 rather than at 0 on the left-hand side. Brinson, oh man, he really, really stuck with this rule. He had countless examples of charts about wages, about flood rises, and all sorts of things showing any time I see an axis that doesn't start at 0, well, he got cross. And let's look at a modern example of how that can work and when that might hold true. So was he right? Should I always start my axes at 0? For this example, I want to use Usain Bolt, fastest sprinter in the world. He smashed the record for the 100 meters 6 years ago, and The Guardian produced a chart where the axis did not start at 0. So here's the data with Brinson's rule being adhered to. That's the change in the 100-meter world record from 1910 to 2010. And it's boring. Not only is it boring, you can't actually see the real impact Usain Bolt had. Also, it's not really very good design because there's a lot of white space. And part of effective communication is also just doing good design. Now, if we break Brinson's rule and start the axis at 9.5 seconds, we have a much more interesting chart. The relative change is what's important, and the impact of Usain Bolt's amazing athletic prowess is there for all to see. You can see that line is so steep there. It's steeper at any time in history. It's also a massive vertical drop in time. So this is clearly an effective way to do it. The other thing to consider is whether you're showing relative time or actual time. In this example, and in fact in most of Brinson's example, but let's talk about this one particularly, the interesting thing is the amount to which Usain Bolt beat the record. It doesn't matter how close to 0 Usain Bolt is getting. What matters is how far away he is from the previous record. And in that case, it's fine to not show 0 because you're not interested in 0. And again, in stock prices, and house prices, these are real world examples. I just want to know whether my stock is going up or down since I bought it. I don't really care how close to zero it is. It's about percentage growth. And the final reason is there are some measurements of time where zero makes no sense. In all of the entirety of future human endeavor, I cannot predict how fast human beings will run the 100 meters, but I can predict it won't be 0 seconds. Maybe it'll be 9.5, maybe it'll 9.0, maybe it'll be lower, but it won't be 0. So there are certain measures where 0 just makes no sense as a value. And one of the reasons I like this example is because when you look at that article on The Guardian and you look at the comments, there's a comment below saying, I like what Symmetric do, who drew the chart where the axes didn't start at 0. And it said, but the axes should start at 0. The way they are right now exaggerates the change too much. Gravy anecdote. That's an anagram of Andy Cotgreave, and yes, that is a photograph of me. I wrote that comment on the 17th of August, 2009. And I think that's really interesting. Wherever you are on your journey of visual analytics, of data visualization, of charting data, however you want to describe it, it's amazing. Your experience will change, and your understandings and your priorities will change over time. I've been in this game for getting on 10 years now, and it's brilliant how my opinions change. And, it really epitomizes what, for me, where Brinson was very hard and fast. He kept on banging on about this for the rest of his life, about these are the rules, you can't break the rules, it's rule, rule, rule. I'm like, well, it's guidelines. At best, it's guidelines. But we should still read Brinson. So let's move on to a penultimate example of best practice. And this is really about Brinson talking about titles and images and, again, engagement over functionality, but sticking with good design. He loved this chart. He got this one, I don't know, I'm not sure the source now, but he got it, and it shows shipping of principal countries of the world. And hurrah, the UK in the 1914 was dominating the world trade, followed fairly far back by the US. And what he loved about this chart was, he said, well, the bar chart's great. The data's there, it's labeled, so it's really easy to read the bar chart. But, bar charts they're not quite that interesting. But at least this chart had a picture of a ship on it. And what he liked was the fact that the ship would sit in the publication, or the whole chart would sit in the publication. And the ship would draw the audience in. Ooh, a picture of a ship. I'll go and see what that is. And then they'd read the bar chart. So they'd get the enticement and the encouragement through the image, and then good labeling, good use of bars, told a good story. That's excellent. And I'll come back to this one, but again, as you've seen, I want to come to a modern example. And this is just one of my favorite examples for the last 5 or 6 years of good use of text, good use of formatting and imagery to create a very amazing visualization. This is a graphic that appeared in the South China Morning Post in 2012 and is designed by a guy called Simon Scar. Really good practitioner. It shows the deaths each month in Iraq. And what Simon Scar chose to do, from 2003 to 2012, that is, what Simon Scar chose to do was to point the bars downwards. So it was a good chart with a slightly unconventional direction. Painted those bars red, and he said, Iraq's bloody toll. So he used the title and the imagery to create a very opinionated dashboard. He's saying that unquestionably there were a huge amount of deaths in Iraq. So the downwards red bars make it look like blood. Title gives you this Iraq's bloody toll sets out how Simon Scar wanted you to interpret the chart. Now I want to change 3 things on this graphic without actually really changing the data at all. The first thing I'm going to do is turn the bars around so they're in the more conventional way, pointing upwards. The second thing I'm going to do is sort of think back to Brinson, use good use of text and labeling, and change the title, Iraq, Deaths on the Decline. Because when you point those bars upwards, it also looks like, yeah, there was a really bad period, but things have really changed. And finally, I'm going to change the color of the bars to a neutral blue. So what I've done is I haven't changed the data, I haven't changed the charts. I've just changed orientation, labeling, titles, and some of the imagery that the chart evokes. And I've completely transformed the message of this dashboard, or infographic, or chart, whatever you want to call it. That, to me, is really the epitome of what Brinton was trying to communicate. Your choices of how you design your visualizations will influence not only the engagement, but also the messages these people, your audience, will take away. And it's really important to get that right. Next to the chart with the ship, or along near the chart with the ship, Brinton also used this as an example of, the two ends of the spectrum. The octopus, he said, would clearly engage people, but showing different sized sacks to show the size and extent of our national waste. Well, what a useless way of showing things, he said, because it just makes no sense. But he did acknowledge that cartoons were effective ways of drawing people in, but they weren't an effective way of showing the data. And, as we saw with our Iraq chart and with lots of charts we see today, you've got to get the balance right. My final example from the book is about mapping. Again, we'll come back to this map. Today, mapping is as easy as connecting to data and double-clicking on it, and a map appears. Again, these are snapshots from Tableau. You connect. Tableau recognizes geographical regions in your data by looking at the field name and the data type. Boom, you get a map. That's amazing. Amazing. And the where question in data has always been important. And so people have strived for 100 years to be able to solve it. The good news is you no longer have to spend days and hours working out, which kind of map pin is most appropriate to use in your map, or how far you should stick the thing in the board, or even where you're going to acquire all these map pins from. But people wanted to make maps just as much then as they do now. Here's the one. The one on the left is freight, street transit passenger counts in Frankfurt, made using balsa wood. The one on the right shows where graduates from Harvard go to live in the US, and you can see they all stay pretty near the US. This one's amazing. They would get piano wire, bake the piano wire to make it hard, then thread these beads on one by one by one by one by one, and then varnish the whole thing, and then stick it in the map. Could you imagine making that map and then somebody says, oh, we got the data wrong? That would be a disaster, wouldn't it? But just like today, people wanted to create amazing maps. And both of these maps, I see echoes of them in modern visualizations that, we still want to show data in this exact same way. In the top left is an example from the New York Times showing incomes along the marathon route in New York. Looks very similar to the Frankfurt one. The bottom right is a screen grab of Excel Power View, which is a great piece of technology, not really getting much adoption because of complexities of the product, but a really clever idea of using 3D in an engaging way. So what we've seen is innovation from this Mr. Brinson. We've seen best practice from Brinson. And his motivation was to help people like you 100 years ago to know if their charts were effective or not. Because remember, charting was quite a new thing when Brinson was writing this book. I mean, today we have no excuse. We've been making charts for 100 years. We should surely be getting this right. At the back of the book, or towards the back of the book, Brinson had two checklists. One for a couple of checklists to ensure you could do this. And again, you could print this thing out and it would be effective today. Some of my friends in the Tableau community who do a Tableau-related podcast or a data-related podcast called Tableau Wannabe. They actually did an episode a few months ago critiquing modern visualizations by using this checklist. It's brilliant because some of it is, well, most of it is totally appropriate, but Brinson was very much binary yes or no guy. And I'm a bit more of a guidelines guy, you know, that there are always reasons to break rules. The checklist is itself a great reflection on society in 1914, because there was lots of talk of the Ben Day work and have you talked to your engraver correctly in order to make sure they understand. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with those kinds of things anymore. Ben Day dots, for those who don't know, was a printing technique where if you printed dots of different colors very, very finely, you could get all sorts of different textures. We just have inkjets. In fact, we just have screens these days. We even rarely print. So Brinson, he wanted to change the world. He wanted to banish pie charts and radar charts and make sure everybody was effective all the time. That was his motivation. Well, what was the impact? Well, the book was well reviewed. I have not been able to find any evidence about how well it sold. I just, if anybody could find that information, it'd be amazing. Did he solve the problem of bad charts? Well, if you Google pie charts today, we are still awash in bad examples of pie charts. There are good pie charts, but there are probably more bad ones. So we are still making lots and lots of charting mistakes. And it's not through a shortage of books on data visualization. Tufte, Stephen Few, Ben Jones, these are three examples of great books I recommend to everybody. Again, the link at the bottom gives you some idea of these. You know, these guys all mention Brinson, and these books, along with all the other data visualization books you can buy, also talk well about effective visualization. But I think the problem is that we're making the mistakes in day one at school. You know, we are not teaching the effective ways to communicate data to children at the first opportunity. My children are 6 and 8 years old, and already they're doing data-related work at school, and when they do data in maths, they get told to do 3D pie charts. And, you know, it's like, really? It's down to us as analysts to educate people as quick as we can, as early as we can, to make effective visualization a fundamental part of just our working knowledge. Because the rules are not complicated. They're mostly common sense. Whenever people get pointed out some of these guidelines, they're like, oh yeah, that's really obvious. So, Brinson, this is a picture of the book. Here it is. This is a picture of the book on my desk, and I have it in front of me as I speak right now. 100 years ago, Willard Brinton wanted people to be able to share their data, express it in an expressive way and an effective way. He was seeing an explosion of big data, massive amount of data, but the foundations were not being put in place in these data organizations to enable effective communication. He recognized as executives of small brain capacity, but he recognized them also as overworked, under pressure people who needed to be able to consume information quickly. All of that is exactly the same thing we're trying to struggle with in 2015. What I hope I've done today is give you a great intro into the world of Brinson, but also give you this sense of opportunity that we have in 2015 today. We are going to make some of the same mistakes. Some of those are kind of hard to change because there'll always be more data than I can quite process. It won't always be in the shape I quite need to analyze it just the way I want. So there will always be headaches. But as Brinson saw and as we see today, there are effective ways of communicating data which will get you over way more hurdles than you could have done 100 years ago. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Brill for Q&A. But first, before we do, thank you so much for listening in on this webinar. I love the history of data visualization, and getting hold of a copy of this book was a real highlight of my whole kind of career as an analyst. There's way more examples, and if you go to tabsoft.co/Brinton, you can go see loads more examples. Here's just a few that I talk about on that blog. You can go and read the book itself. And we're from Tableau. It's our delight to sponsor these webinars. We like to try and think that we channel Brinson through our product by keeping you on the straight and narrow, keeping you on the good path. And if you want to divert from it, that's fine, but at least you will do it in a conscious way and not an accidental way. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll just hand it back to Bill for a moment.
Yep, Andy, hey, thank you so much for that very excellent presentation. That was a lot of fun, too, to learn about Mr. Brinton. So we'll get started with today's Q&A session, and I want to thank the audience for their participation. We have a great many questions that have come in during the presentation. We'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. So during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen because it's got Andy's contact information on it, as well as that URL that some of you have asked about, so that you can find his website with the Brinton blogs and even the Brinton book. So Andy, let's get started. Obviously, Willard Brinton was a very rules-driven guy. You think he'd be happy with the state of visualization today?
Great question. Yes. Would he be happy with the state of visualization today? I suspect he would. What's amazing, there seems to have been in the last 30 years almost 3 ages of visualization. If you think back to when Windows was first released. In fact, you know what? Is it tomorrow? Did you know tomorrow? I think it's tomorrow. Tomorrow is the 30th anniversary of the release of Excel. Now, so 30 years ago, Excel came out, right? And when they designed the chart engines in the first few versions of Excel, were they reading Brinton or were they excited by their graphics cards? I think they were excited by their graphics cards, and so we got set off on the wrong path for about a good generation of people, not through ill will, just by accident. And so we ended up with this 2 decades of just 3D horrors, awful situation. And then at the turn of the start of the 21st century, I think people like Stephen Few really started pushing back and being like, oh, come on, you want to communicate data, you need to be functional. You need to be really functional. So that was the massive pushback to Brinton, pure Brinton theory, I think. And then since then, then there was the battles of like infographics turned around, and they were all kind of awful, but they were awful functionally, but they were really popular. Oh, what's going on there? And so the more recently, you've got people like Alberto Cairo, who The Functional Art is one of my favorite books on data visualization, and he talks so amazingly about a balance between functionality and beauty and engagement. And so I think Brinton would be pretty delighted, actually, because there's so many examples of great practice, and there's so many avenues for which to pursue and critique and follow that, and even all the products now, most visualization products have dropped the excesses of the 3D pie chart awfulness from the 90s. So I think he'd be quite happy. I'd love to know what other people think.
Yeah, Andy, thanks for that great answer. And I see in your comment, as well as in your presentation, that obviously all of us want to continue to try and innovate and get our own ideas in about how charts should look, and to try and do things a little differently over time. So that kind of works against Brinton's sense of rules. Is there are there actually guidelines for correct presentation? Not rules, but for example, a right mix of text and chart type and image for a particular visualization to be effective.
Yes, I think there are. I think, if you go back, I'm just going to push the slides with the book on it to you all. There are a great many modern books on visualization. I would recommend any of these 3, but particularly anything by Stephen Few. Show Me the Numbers. gives you the guidelines extremely well. It's like, okay, if you want to compare, if you want to look at changes over time, then you would use a trend line, right? But then if you want to look at multiple members of a dimension, then you might overlay them on top of each other or not. And again, Stephen Few goes into quite a lot of detail about annotation and titles. His book, Information Dashboard Design, certainly talks about appropriate chart types, appropriate labeling, and the things that the questioner talks about. I write a lot about this as well, and without trying to sound like I'm ducking the answer, the challenge is how much annotation should you put on your chart, right? The answer to that question depends on the audience you're trying to create the chart for. If they are people who know the data inside out, so let's say it's a marketing audience who knows their marketing data inside out, then you probably don't need to guide them very much. Just give them the data. If you're publishing on the public web, then maybe the people don't understand your data. Maybe you're showing something about US road fatalities. That's a dashboard I've been working on recently. It's like, well, the people who are going to view that dashboard aren't experts in that domain, so I have to give them more titles and more text in order to do something. And I think what Brinson didn't appreciate, but we have to appreciate now, is that, you know, any data and any chart is going to work for some people, but it's not going to work for others. And you're going to have to tweak it to make it work for those others, but maybe at the expense of that first audience. Every visualization is a compromise. And once you accept that, then you're on a good path to at least achieving your objective, even if you can't achieve everyone in your audience's objective.
Every visualization is a compromise. That's an interesting point. By the way, is Tableau as a product simply ultimately flexible, or does it attempt to give guidance as to what looks good and what doesn't look good when I use that tool to make charts?
Well, that's a great question. We built Tableau, very much with the Stephen Few and the Brinson approach to functionality first. So we will steer you down the path of the most effective charts. We have one part of our product called Show Me. Like, well, if you select a time and a dimension and a measure, it's like, well, we can show you this as a timeline, or maybe as various other things. But we will always try and default to the most effective visualization for what you've selected and what you have on the canvas at a given moment. But we would never profess to denying you the opportunity to do what the heck you want, right? So if you want to show it slightly differently, that's fine. But what you won't get in Tableau is 3D or gradient colors. We sort of maintain this sparse appearance which focuses on the data rather than bling, as I guess you could call it. Right. So I can have my pie chart no matter how bad it is. And eat it. Yes, you can have your pie chart and eat it. Yeah.
Yeah. My observation about visualizations is that it seems that the best ones seem to incorporate a good deal of artistic sense, and I'm no artist. How do I overcome that, or should I just not worry about that? It's good to overcome it. You should overcome it. I suspect that everybody has a creative seam somewhere within them. The thing about art and data is that it comes back to this need to engage with people. And yes, the best pieces of work have this. You look at it and you're like, I'm looking at something beautiful, but I'm also looking at something functional. Right? If it doesn't have that functional stuff, then it's data, it's art, and that's fine. But that's not really what we need in business. We need functionality. And you may not think of yourselves as creative, but there are simple things to just make the experience of somebody using dashboard really easy. Simplify the color scheme. Just choose a font that's really nice. Take as many grid lines, as many of the noise off the chart as you can. Try those things out. But then show this thing to somebody and sit down and say, look at that chart and tell me what it tells you. And if they look at it blankly,
then you've got it wrong. But if they look at it and go, oh, I can see that this happened here and that happened there, then that's success, right? So you've created something artistic enough to succeed in, well, at least educating what the person you've asked, which is probably a good proxy for everybody else.
Well, thanks for letting me off the hook. Oh, I should test. That's a good idea. But, you know, kind of the extreme of the artistic vision that we get these days are these very attractive and sometimes informative large vertical infographics. How do you feel about those as data representations?
Well, it comes a little bit down to the slide that I've just pushed to the screen. You know, Brinson recognized this last year. An infographic, right? A good infographic is a good piece of work, right? So not all infographics are bad, but there was a explosion of terrible infographics where people were prioritizing cartoons of octopuses, bright colors, crazy chart types, all sorts of typography, you know, things all over the place, and things that you had to scroll down. And the problem with those were, you know, it's like, what am I trying to see? You know, there was no coherence in the story. There was no coherence in the narrative. There was so much going on that, you know, in a web world, we were like, wow, this is bright, it's cool. But if you actually stopped scrolling and sharing and said, well, what am I actually seeing? What am I actually understanding from this infographic? If the actual, you know, the actual meaning and purpose was nothing, then it was a disaster, right? You know, it was a waste of your time. It was a waste of the designer's time. And again, so what Brinson was saying 100 years ago is like the person who can marry this cartoon interface, like an octopus, with the effectiveness of the bar charts is the person who gets it right. And again, I think, you know, now in 2015, we're sort of converging a little bit better in many places where, yeah, you can do really good quality infographics. So it's not that they're all bad. It's just that they've been lots of bad.
Okay, and you know, one of the things that that I'm very interested in personally, you know, in this day and age where we're presenting or preparing data visualizations for citizens of many different countries at the same time. You know, you might be presenting a chart, a single chart that should play well in North America and South America and the Middle East and even Asia. Do you see a lot of cultural differences, or how do we bridge those cultural senses of color and shape and that sort of thing?
Well, that's a great question, and it comes a little bit. Self-awareness as an author is obviously very important. The Iraq's toll chart we looked at, you know, that was red. Most cultures see red as danger, as bad, but danger and bad, but not all cultures do. So some Eastern cultures would look at that and be like, well, that's quite a neutral color, or a color of happiness. And so color choice is something you have to be wary of. And you know, so if you are going to publish something with a truly global audience, then you've got to be sensitive to it. The other challenge, of course, is text and language. It's very hard to localize visualizations for consumption by the whole world. You know, that's a very complex thing to do. It's possible. But again, thinking about how would the text look if it was going to be translated? Would I even have to do a left-right orientation to fit with the way Arabic languages work? You know, if you look at all the charts I've shown you, all the charts on screen are built with a left-to-right orientation. It's something, you know, I would confess I don't design my visualizations very often for that, because I generally am aware I'm going to be talking to a US and European audience. But color choice is certainly the most sensitive issue I would consider, as well as text orientation.
Well, Andy, thank you for those great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions today that weren't answered, we'll be sending those questions to Andy and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you today after today's webinar. I just have a few quick announcements to make. So if you would please mark your calendars for October 6th and our next Data Science Central webinar, which is Democratizing Data and Predictive Analytics while Ensuring Governance and Transparency. And that's going to be sponsored by LavaStorm and Tableau. Also, Let me remind you that today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today and can be found on the home page of datasciencecentral.com in the webinar tab at the top of the page. Well, that brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions, and a special thanks again to Tableau for their sponsorship, and especially to our speaker, Andy Cotgreave, for his insight into today's topic. My name is Bill Vorhies, and I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again on October 6th. Have a great day.